Well, the other day I heard somebody talking on the radio about an old band. And what the person said about this band is, they said, this band didn't sell many albums, but everyone who bought their album started a band. Now, I think it was a bit of an overstatement, but his point was pretty clear. He's saying these people influenced a lot of musicians. And because of these people, there are a whole lot of musicians that we all know that came as a result. The thing is, every musician has influences. And if you hear people interview a musician, one of the most common questions you'll hear is, so who are your influences? In other words, who did you learn from? Who did you mimic? Who did you copy? As a musician, that's what you do. You listen to certain music and you say, I want to play like that. And you do, and that's how musicians come about. And so they always ask, who are your influences? But the thing is, it's true in every walk of life. We all have influences. Whether you're talking about sports, there are athletes who play just like someone else. You have someone like Kobe who watched Michael Jordan play and mimicked everything he did and then did it a little better. There's my personal bias. Okay. So anyway, but you have people in sports, in business, you learn from people, you act like people, you do like other people. In writing, in baking, in sewing, in building, we all have influences. We've all learned from people who've gone before us. We've learned from someone or somewhere. We've picked up ideas from people. We've picked up different ways of doing things, or we just flat out copied others. We all have influences in our lives. But there is one who ought to be our greatest influence. There is one who we want to pattern our lives after. You have heard me talk about being like Jesus. And my prayer is that all of us would be becoming more and more like Jesus. That he would be our greatest influence. That we would be more and more like him. Now, I'm going to admit something to you. I am not perfectly like Jesus. I'm sure you all knew that already. I'm probably far from it. But he's the one that I want to get close to. He's the one that I want to learn from. He's the one that I want to pick up traits from. As God's children, we have the privilege of being changed by him and reflecting his character. He can be our greatest influence. And today, as we get into our passage here in 2 Samuel, we're going to look at a few chapters. They're short chapters, and they deal with different little subjects. But as we get into these chapters, into our passage, we will see some ways that David was influenced by God and reflected God's character. So we begin here at the beginning seeing that God's way is justice and fairness. Now, chapter 8 is basically a report of David's successes. It's a summary, and it deals with things from different times, some in the past, some in the future from this perspective. But it's a summary of all that David did, his successes as king of Israel. And it's a summary of how God had given Israel the rest or the security that he promised that he would give them, and that he was going to give them through David as their king, their leader. So let's begin chapter 8 and verse 1. It says, after this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Metheg Ammah out of the hand of the Philistines. And he defeated Moab, and he measured them with a line, making them lie down on the ground. 2 lines he measured to be put to death, and 1 full line to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, and he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. And David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers, and David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 men of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And David took the shields of gold that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Barathai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took very much bronze. And so we have this summary, but the first thing we see is is the Philistines. First talks about the Philistines. Now the Philistines were the biggest enemies of Israel. They brought the most trouble to Israel. And we are told here that they were defeated by Israel. And we're told that David took Metheg Ammah. Now, your version may have those words and it may not. It may say something slightly different. But some people see these words, Metheg Ammah, and understand it as a city name. But these words literally mean bridle of mother, or the mother. Bridle, like what you put in a horse that's with a bit that's connected, control horse, of mother. That doesn't seem to make any sense, so people assume it's just a city name. However, in 1 Chronicles chapter 18, the parallel passage to this, it says that David took Gath. Now, Gath was a major Philistine city. In fact, it's where Goliath came from. And so some understand this statement, this taking the bridle of the mother, to mean that he has taken control of the mother or chief city of the Philistines, namely Gath. And so, but the point being made here is that the Philistines couldn't stand against David. They were defeated, and this defeat is significant because now Israel is the greatest power of the region. And not only has he defeated the Philistines, but they have been subdued, meaning they've been put down. The Philistine power is now broken. The Philistine reign over the area is over. Their mistreatment of Israel is done. David is now ruling the land. Now, we're also told about David allowing a third of the men from Moab to live. Now, we read that and it sounds strange to our ears and it may sound harsh, but let me explain what's happening here. And this is actually a very strategic decision that David has made. You see, David couldn't let the entire army live because then he would be at a risk of being attacked again by the Moabites. And so he couldn't just let them live, he had to weaken the army. However, he had to keep some fighting men alive because Moab was a buffer between him and other enemies who might come from further out to the east. And so the Moabites are now David's subjects, and they bring tribute to David, but they are also his outer defense. Before they actually get to Israel, they have to go through the Moabites. So he wants to leave them with some strength, but not too much strength to where they're going to cause problems. And then it goes on and gives us this list of victories. And the enemies of Israel came from literally every direction, north, south, east, west. And David won those victories in every direction. Now, they fought against some very large and well-equipped armies. And those armies lost. And we're told that when David wins these battles, that he doesn't keep all of the horses and chariots. And that actually, it's kind of a strange thing. Why would they tell us that little detail? They're telling us that little detail to tell us that David is actually following God's law. Because in Deuteronomy, the king was told not to accumulate many horses. The purpose for that is that the king was to trust in God rather than an abundance of war machines. So their strength was from God, and they knew that. So they were to trust God rather than to collect a bunch of war machines, or chariots specifically. But this summary gives us the impression that no enemy could stand against David. That his army was powerful, that they were skilled, and they were seemingly invincible. But then the true source of power is made clear for us. In verse 6, the statement is made, the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. That was the true source of David's strength. That God was with him. That God gave the victory to Israel. You see, God is the one who brought peace and security to his people, Israel. Let's continue reading. Verse 9. When Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, Toi sent his son Joram to King David to ask about his health and to bless him because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had often been at war with Toi, and Joram brought with him articles of silver and of gold and of bronze. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold that he dedicated from all the nations he subdued, from Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And so we have this guy, Toi. Toi was a king, and he was happy to see his own enemy defeated. You see, Hadadezer had been giving him trouble, and David took care of that problem for him. And so he was happy to see that, and he sends his son to visit David and to congratulate him, and he sends gifts to him to show his gratitude and to get on David's good side. In other words, he's probably trying to get David to make a treaty with him so that he's safe, that he's like, I won't bother you, you won't bother me. Okay, we're good, thanks. And so he sends them and he gives them gifts. And David takes all these gifts and all the gold and silver and the plunder that he had taken from plunder from the other victories, and he dedicates it to Lord. And he gives it to God, and it actually will be used for the building of the temple later on when his son Solomon makes it. Let's keep reading verse 13. It says, and David made a name for himself when he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt. Then he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons. And all the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder, and Zadok, the king of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the sons of Abiathar, were priests, and Sariah was secretary, and Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were priests. And so here at the end, we get this repeated, the continued report of the successes of David. But there are two key comments made in those verses. The first is that God caused David to be successful. Now, we earlier already had that statement that God gave victory to David wherever he went. But it's repeated here, reiterated again for us here, because this is an important detail for us to understand. David's success came from God. The power and the authority he had really belonged to God. Now, it's interesting that it says that David made a name for himself. But it was actually God's doing that brought David that notoriety, that brought David that fame. It was God who lifted David up and gave him, was the power behind him. In fact, this was one of the promises that God had made to David back in chapter 7, that you will have a great name. And so God has made this happen. God has caused David to be successful. Now, the second key comment here is that David administered justice and equity to all his people. This is how David reigned when he was king. In justice and equity to all his people. This is the character of David's reign. He did what was right. He did what was fair. He did, and he did this not just for some people, but for all his people. So he was just and he was fair. And in doing so, David was reflecting the character of God. Now, let me just make one side note here. David is ruling right. We see that here. He's acting the way that God's representative, the king, is supposed to. But next week, we will see David fall short. He will fail and do he will fail to do what is right. He will fail to be fair and just. So on one hand, we look at this and we look at David's life and we see David is a picture of what the kingdom of God is supposed to be. On the other hand, when we look at David, he shows us the need for one greater than himself. Jesus is the perfect king. Jesus will rule with perfect justice, and his kingdom will be righteous and good. He will never fall short. So in David, we get this glimpse of the kingdom. But we also see clearly that we need Jesus. Well, back to our key comments, our two key comments here. That God caused David to be successful, and he administered with justice and equity to all his people. These are the main points of this chapter. God blesses his people, and his people act like him. They reflect his character. They follow his example, and they deal with people justly. And you see, David learned this, dealing justly and fairly. He learned this from his experience with God, what God did in his life, and he also learned it from God's word. In fact, he read the law. If you read the Old Testament law, there is a whole lot in there about justice. There's a whole lot in there about things like don't cheat in business. Don't have scales that are false. It tells you don't lie in court. In other words, you don't testify against someone unjustly. He says you don't take advantage of people. Now this is especially stressed to kings and to leaders. You don't take advantage of people just because you might have more power or more money or whatever it is, more social status. You don't take advantage of people. So God's word, his law, is full of these ideas. You be just, you be fair, you do what is right. You treat people with value like God would. Now, we can move forward to the prophets, and of course this wasn't written at David's time. But later on, one of the prophets, Micah, he wrote in Micah 6:8, he says, He has shown thee, O Lord, she has shown thee, O man, what the Lord requires of you, but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. You see, he's saying this is what it means to walk with God. This is what it means to represent God. You do justice. You do what is right. You are fair. You have compassion on people. You do mercy. And you walk humbly with your God. Not arrogant. Not thinking, oh, I'm better than everyone else. But you walk humbly, following your God in obedience to him and submission to him. This is God's way. You do what is right. You do what is fair. You treat people well, not as if they are less important than you. So that's God's way. But God's way is also being faithful to your promises. And David reflects God in this as well. Let's look at chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. And David said, Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now, this is a very honest question. David is saying, isn't there anyone left alive from Saul's family? See, Saul's family has pretty much been decimated, whether it was through battle or through someone else, unjust, evil men who killed people that didn't deserve it. Saul's family is pretty much gone, and David's looking around and he's saying, who's left? Is there anyone? So he asks, is there not anyone that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Remember, Jonathan is Saul's son, David's close friend. Verse 2, now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. So this is a man who worked for Saul. He served Saul. And they said, if anyone's going to know, this guy's going to know. So they bring him in, and David asks him, so you're Ziba? And he says, yes. And he says, and his response is, I am your servant. In other words, he's saying, I'm submitting to you, David. He must be a little afraid. He doesn't want to be on Saul's side here. He wants to be with David. But he submits to him and he says, yes, that's me. Verse 3, and the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him? Now this is interesting. David changed his question a little bit. His first question is so that I might show kindness because of Jonathan. His second question is there not someone who I can show the kindness of God to him? You see, David, when he's talking to Ziba, the servant here, he says, I want to be kind like God is kind. And so that's what he says. I want to show him the kindness of God. In other words, I want to show kindness the way God would. And Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet. Verse 4. The king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. Now here's a couple interesting things. They know about Mephibosheth. That's Jonathan's son. They know about him. But I'm thinking that the people who knew about Mephibosheth kept it quiet. Because what would normally happen when a king was replaced by another king, or one dynasty was replaced by another dynasty, is that the new king would kill the rest of the family of the previous king. Why? So they weren't a threat. They weren't a threat to come back and say, I'm going to take over the throne. They couldn't make that claim to the throne and say, I'm the rightful king, and revolt. And so kings would often do that. So they probably kept it quiet that Mephibosheth was there. Another thing we notice here is Mephibosheth is being cared for by someone else. He is crippled. He can't take care of himself. He can't provide for himself. So he's living at some other man's house who is then watching over him and taking care of him and his family. Verse 5, then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, behold, I am your servant. One more thing. In verse 7, David said to him, do not fear. Mephibosheth comes to David and falls down before him, and he basically is submitting to him just like Ziba had. I'm your servant. He's probably afraid that David called him there to kill him. Of course, we know that David's purpose is the opposite of that. He wants to bless him. He wants to show him kindness. He wants to do good to him like God would. But Mephibosheth comes in and he's probably trembling. And David says, don't be afraid. Verse 7, David said to him, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. So he tells him what he's going to do. I'm going to show you kindness. And he again talks about Jonathan, because he had made a promise to Jonathan to do good to his family. But then he continues. He says, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. So there's two things that he's doing here. We didn't notice, first of all, he's leaving him alive. That's really all he promised. But he says, I'm going to give you all the land of Saul. So remember, Saul was king. There was a lot of property he owned. There was a lot of stuff that he owned. And David now says, it's all yours, Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth went from being a guy who was poor, who couldn't care for himself, who didn't have anything, to being a very wealthy man. God has blessed him with this. David has blessed, well, ultimately God, but David has blessed him with this. But not only that, but David says, and you will eat at my table. That means he's now part of the inner circle of the king. He's there with all the advisors. He's in the know. He'll be there for all the conversations around the dinner table. He says, you will eat at my table. Verse 8, and he paid homage to him and said, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Mephibosheth simply being very humble and saying, who am I? Why would you do this for me? This is incredible. Verse 9, then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring into the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servants, so will your servants do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. So here's the cool thing. David says, okay, you guys, you're going to take care of all this stuff for him. So you serve Saul, now you're serving Mephibosheth. You're going to take care of all his land. You're going to plant his crops. You're going to harvest his crops. You're going to make sure everything is good for him. He says, but he's going to eat at my table. And then it says that he ate at his table, not just like an advisor or someone else in the king's court, but he says like one of David's sons. So he was made like family. He treated him like family. He ate at his table like one of David's sons. Verse 12, and Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. So last note we see there is that he moved to Jerusalem because he had to eat. If he was going to eat at the king's table every day, he needed to live there. So he moved to Jerusalem. But here's the thing I want to pull out of all this. As king, David didn't have to do this. In fact, it was very unusual for a king to do this. In that time period, it would, like I said, it would not be surprising if he would have tried to kill all of Saul's people. But David doesn't do that. And I think there's two reasons why David does this. One, he states, I want to show kindness to your father Jonathan. And so the first reason is to keep his promise. There are actually two promises that David is keeping by keeping Mephibosheth alive. Because if you remember, Saul asked David not to wipe out his descendants. When Saul recognized that David was going to be king, he asked him to swear to God that he would not do this, that he would not kill all his descendants. You'll remember what happened. It was when David and one of his men snuck into the camp of Saul at night while everyone was sleeping. They walked all the way through all of the soldiers. Not a single one noticed them. They walked right to Saul where he was sleeping. They took his water jug and his spear that was right next to his head, walked all the way, had a little conversation there, then walked all the way out of the camp, and David called to him from across the valley, hey, why aren't you protecting your king? It was at that point that Saul realized David's going to be king. What God said is going to happen. And he asked David, please don't kill my descendants. Because he knew what would normally happen in that kind of a situation. Please don't kill my descendants. But David also made a covenant with Jonathan. When Jonathan had found out that his dad was after David, and Jonathan said, I know that you're going to be king. God's going to bless you and make you king. And when he does, please remember my family. Please do good to my family. Be faithful to my family. And so he made a promise. And David, since he made a promise, he's going to keep it. And he seeks out Mephibosheth. He seeks out Jonathan's descendants so he might do good and be faithful to them. But I think the second reason why David is doing this is because this is what he's learned from God. I mean, God is faithful. And God has kept his promises to David. And he sees how God is, and he says, if I'm one of God's people, I want to do the same. And so he's seen this in God, and he wants to do the same. And that's why he says, I want to show the kindness of God. I want to do like God. You see, David has been influenced by God, and he is reflecting the character of God. And as we read on here, into chapter 10, we're going to see that David continues to follow God's way by being loyal. Look at chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. It says, "After this, the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun, his son, reigned in his place. And David said, I will deal loyally with Hanun, the son of Nahash, and as his father dealt loyally with me. So David sent by his servants to console him concerning his father. And David's servants came into the land of the Ammonites. But the prince of the Ammonites said to Hanun, their lord, do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he is honoring your father? Has not David sent his servants to you to search the city and to spy it out and to overthrow it? So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half the beard of each and cut off their garments in the middle at their hips and sent them away. When it was told David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, remain at Jericho until your beards have grown and then return. So here's the situation. The Ammonite king dies and his son replaces him. David wants to deal loyally with him. Now, this word translated deal loyally here is the same word that was translated as show kindness earlier. You see, this word here carries all of those ideas. The ideas of love, of loyalty, of faithfulness, and kindness. It's a word that is often used to describe the way God deals with his people in loyal love and kindness. But he says, I want to show loyalty to him as his father was loyal to me. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. King Nahash and the Ammonites are the people who years earlier, we read in 1 Samuel 11, who came and laid siege to Jabesh Gilead. And when they laid siege to attack Jabesh Gilead, they called for help. And Saul, early in his reign, one of the first big things he did, he got up and he led an army and he beat the Ammonites and delivered the people of Jabesh Gilead from the Ammonites. So he rescued the city. This was one of the early things in Saul's reign. But apparently since then, David has since formed good relations with that king. And probably has some kind of agreement or a treaty with him. But when that king, Nahash, died, David now wants to honor that relationship that he had and be faithful to his son, the new king, as well. And so he wants to continue those good relations with them. And so he sends this delegation to offer his sympathies. And Hanun, the new king, who is the son of the older king, listens to his advisors who don't trust David and accuse him of coming to spy on them. Basically, he's just wanting to spy on us so that he can come and wipe us out, is what they say. Now, this is the same accusation that Joab made about Abner when he came to help David earlier on. He's like, oh, he's just coming to spy on us. And so I don't know if this is just paranoid people, or they are just like, this is just the way the world works right now, or if they're just, or if these are just troublemakers who want to have their own way. But the king listens to them, and we're told that the king humiliates David's men. How does he do that? First of all, he cuts off half their beards. Now, when it says he cuts off half their beard, it doesn't mean he cut off the bottom part. It means he cut off half of their beards. So they looked funny. But this is more than just looking funny. You see, he humiliated them because by shaving another man's beard, you're saying, I have control over you. I have power over you. You can't stop me from shaving off half of your beard and making you look like a fool. And so this is a big thing. It's an expression of dominance over another man. So they do that. Well, then we're told that he cut off their robes short enough to leave them at least partially exposed. And you can get the picture of these men pulling down their robes, running out of town. But he cuts off the robes and leaves it. I mean, this is embarrassing. But this is just wrong. David's kindness and his faithfulness is met not with gratitude and hospitality, but his kindness and faithfulness is met with distrust, with hostility, and with this humiliating attack against his men. But in doing this to his men, this is also a rejection of David and his offer of continued good relationships, or continue of the treaty that he may have had with his father. You see, David's men represent David. And so as his representatives, when Hanun rejects and mistreats the representatives of David, it's the same as if he had done it to David himself. And so he's rejecting and mistreating David himself. Now David hears about what they did, and he tells his men to stay in Jericho for a while. Let your beards grow back. You could stay there long enough for your beards to grow back, and then they can come home without any further humiliation. So they get to just hang out there on the outskirts of Israelite territory, let their beard grow back, and then come home and when things are fine. You see, David does this because he's looking out for the good of his men. He's looking out for their good. Well, let's keep reading and see what happens. Verse 6. When the Ammonites saw that they had become a stench to David, the Ammonites sent and hired the Syrians of Beth-Rahab and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Maacah, and 1,000 men, and the men of Tob, 12,000 men. And when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the hosts of the mighty men. And the Ammonites came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the gate, and the Syrians of Zobah and Rahab and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in the open country. Now, what these people, what the king did to David's men, David's representatives, was not wise. And you get the impression as you read this that they all of a sudden realize that. They realize they become a stench to David. In other words, they stink to him. And that's actually kind of funny. But they stink to him. But what it means is they are repulsed or repulsive to him. He is repulsed by them. In other words, what they have done is repulsive. And he's not happy with them. And because of that, they expect that David will come and attack them because of their aggressive and shameful treatment of his men. Not to mention, those actions that they took ended the treaty or the agreement or the good relations they had with David. So they go out and they hire some mercenaries. They say, we need an army to protect us. They hire people to come and fight for them against David. They put together this coalition to fight against David. It's a large army. David finds out about it, this large army, and that is ready to march against Israel. So he sends out his army to meet them in battle. And look what happens in verse 9. It says, when Joab saw that the battle was set against him both in front and in the rear, he chose some of the best men of Israel and arrayed them against the Syrians. The rest of his men he put in the charge of Abishai, his brother, and he arrayed them against the Ammonites. And he said, if the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come and help you. Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God. And may the Lord do what seems good to him. I think that's one of the best things I've ever heard Joab say. May the Lord do what seems good to him. Verse 13, so Joab and the people who were with him drew near to battle against the Syrians, and they fled before him. And when the Ammonites saw that the Syrians fled, they likewise fled before Abishai and entered the city. Then Joab returned from fighting against the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. And so Joab gets there and he sees that the fighting is going to be on two fronts, and he expects that the Syrians were the stronger army. And so he gathers up a group of some of the best soldiers they have, and he takes them and leads them against the Syrians. And he sends all the rest with Abishai, his brother, to fight against the Ammonites. And he says, and we'll communicate with each other, and whoever needs help will help the other one. So they go into battle. Well, the Syrians appear to be no match for Joab and quickly turn and run away. When the Ammonites see that the Syrians are running away, what do? They get up and run away too, because they're like, we can't fight these people. And so they run away, but when they run away, they run and hide inside the walls of their city. But when Joab sees that everybody's run away and they're hiding, the battle's done, let's just go home. So apparently they're not interested in making advances at this point. They're just putting down the revolt. And they just go home. Well, keep reading. because it's not over yet. Verse 15. But when the Syrians saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together. And Hadadezer sent and brought out the Syrians who were beyond the Euphrates. They came to Helam with Shobah, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, at the head. And when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Helam. The Syrians arrayed themselves against David and fought with him. And the Syrians fled before Israel. And David killed the Syrians of the men of 700 chariots and 40,000 horsemen, and wounded Shobach, the commander of their army, so that he died there. And when all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and became subject to them. So the Syrians were afraid to save the Ammonites anymore. So the Syrians at this point, they decide they're not done, and they decide to try again. So they regather their army, and they get even more men. And David again hears about this gathering army. Apparently he has a very good intelligence network. He hears about them, and David gathers Israel's army and personally leads them into battle. And David and his men, they go and they win another decisive victory. The coalition between the Syrians and the Ammonites is broken because the Syrians can't win against Israel. And they're afraid to help the Ammonites. And they submit to a treaty agreement with Israel. Now, all of this started because of Hanun's disloyal response to David's gesture of loyalty. David learned loyalty from God. Not only because God tells his people to be faithful and tells his people to be loyal, but because God is faithful and God is loyal. And David had experienced it firsthand. And now David is reflecting God's character. He's living out what he has learned from God. So who is your greatest influence? Who's your greatest influence? Are you growing in your reflection of God's character? In your relations, your interactions with people, are you just? Do you do what is right? Are you fair? Do you keep your word, keep your promises? Are you loyal? Are you faithful and kind? You see, God is all of these things. And the more time you spend with him, the more you will learn from him. And the more you learn from him, the more he will influence your life. The more he will change you to become more like him. Now, as a dad, I see the influence I have on my kids. And there are times when my kids have done something or said something that I look at that and I say, that's my kid. Because they do something that's just like me. Or they said something, no, I'm talking about the good things. But they've done something that's just like me. They've done something that makes the pride well up inside of me. There's like, oh, he's acting like me. She's thinking like me. That's my kid. Now, don't get me wrong. They're always my kids. And I love them no matter what. I'm not talking about them earning my affection or earning my approval. I'm just simply saying sometimes I look at them and say, yes, I love that in them. And I can imagine God watching us, his children, and saying, that's my kid. He's acting like me. She's thinking like me. That's my kid. So who's your greatest influence?